The text message glowed in the darkness of his bedroom. "I've been watching you too, Mark. Meet me on the rooftop in 10 minutes. Mark's heart pounded as he read it again, hardly believing his luck. After months of silent nods in the hallway, the Ice Queen next door had finally thawed. He had no idea that climbing those stairs would change everything, not just for him, but for his daughter too. If you're wondering whether some risks are worth taking, stay with me until the end. And if this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to see more real stories that might just change how you see the world around you. Mark Sullivan hadn't always been alone. 3 years ago, he'd had it all: a beautiful wife, a newborn daughter, and a promising career as an architect. Then came the accident. A rainy night, a truck driver who'd fallen asleep at the wheel, and suddenly he was a widower with a 6-month-old baby girl. The grief had nearly destroyed him, but Lily needed him. So day by day, he learned to be both mother and father to his daughter, putting one foot in front of the other until walking through life without Sarah became his new normal. They'd moved to the apartment building in downtown Portland 8 months ago when Mark's firm offered him a promotion he couldn't refuse. The building was perfect, close to work, good schools nearby for when Lily would start kindergarten, and a rooftop garden where he could sometimes sketch while Lily played in the small sandbox the building management had installed for the handful of families who lived there. That's where he first noticed her, apartment 4B. Tall, with dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders, and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. She always wore headphones, always carried a leather messenger bag, and never, ever smiled. Not at him, not at Lily, not at anyone in the building as far as he could tell. "Daddy, why is that lady so sad?" Lily had asked one afternoon as they rode the elevator together with the woman from 4B. Mark had felt his face flush with embarrassment. "Shoo, honey. Not everyone is sad just because they're quiet." The woman had glanced at them, her expression unreadable, before exiting on the 4th floor without a word. After that, Mark made a point of smiling whenever they passed her in the hallway or lobby. Sometimes he'd offer a polite, "Good morning," or "Have a nice day." She would acknowledge him with the barest nod, never breaking stride, never removing her headphones. The building manager had mentioned once that she was some kind of writer or journalist who worked from home. Mark had found himself wondering what she wrote, what her voice sounded like, whether she ever laughed. It was ridiculous, this fascination with a woman who clearly wanted nothing to do with him or anyone else in the building. Mark hadn't dated since Sarah died. Between work and raising Lily, he barely had time to shower some days, let alone pursue a relationship. But there was something about the mystery woman in 4B that had gotten under his skin. Then came the night of the blackout. A summer storm had knocked out power to half the city, including their building. Mark had been putting Lily to bed when the lights went out, plunging them into darkness. "Daddy!" Lily had cried out, her voice small and frightened. "It's okay, sweetheart," he'd reassured her, fumbling for his phone to use as a flashlight. "Just a power outage. The lights will come back soon." He'd managed to find candles and was lighting them when a knock came at the door. Opening it, he'd found himself face to face with the woman from 4B, her features softened in the candlelight. "Do you have any extra batteries?" she'd asked, her voice lower and huskier than he'd imagined. "My laptop died, and I have a deadline tomorrow." "I think so," he'd replied, trying not to stare. "Come in while I look." She'd hesitated before stepping inside, glancing around his apartment with curious eyes. Lily had appeared in the hallway, clutching her stuffed elephant. "Who are you?" she'd asked bluntly. "I'm Emma," the woman had replied, crouching down to Lily's level. "I live downstairs." "You're the lady who never smiles," Lily had said, making Mark wish the floor would open up and swallow him whole. But to his surprise, Emma had laughed, a genuine, warm sound that transformed her face. "I smile sometimes," she'd told Lily. "Just not when I'm thinking hard about my stories." "You tell stories?" Lily's eyes had widened with interest. "I write them," Emma had explained. "For magazines and newspapers." Mark had returned with the batteries, watching in amazement as his normally shy daughter chatted animatedly with the woman he'd thought of as the Ice Queen. Emma had thanked him for the batteries, promised Lily she'd tell her about her story sometime, and left. After that night, something had shifted. Emma would remove her headphones when she saw them in the hallway, offering a small smile and sometimes even stopping to talk to Lily. Mark learned that she was a freelance journalist who specialized in investigative pieces, often working on tight deadlines. She'd moved to Portland from Chicago after a situation she didn't elaborate on, and she lived alone except for a cat named Hemingway. What she didn't do was flirt. Any time Mark tried to steer their brief conversations towards something more personal, she would politely but firmly redirect or find a reason to end the exchange. It was maddening. He couldn't tell if she wasn't interested or just incredibly guarded. Then came Mrs. Abernathy's birthday party. The elderly woman in 2A had turned 80, and the building had thrown her a small celebration in the community room. Mark had been surprised to see Emma there, standing awkwardly by the refreshment table with a plastic cup of punch. "Didn't expect to see you here," he'd said, joining her. "Mrs. Abernathy lets me interview her sometimes," Emma had replied. She was a civil rights activist in the 60s. "Has some amazing stories." They'd talked for nearly an hour that night, longer than all their previous conversations combined. Mark had learned that Emma was 34, had grown up in Michigan, and had wanted to be a journalist since she was 12. She'd asked about his work as an architect, listened intently as he described his current project renovating a historic theater downtown. When Lily had fallen asleep on one of the couches, Mark had reluctantly said he needed to get her to bed. This was nice, he'd told Emma. "We should do it again sometime. Maybe without the birthday cake and party hats." She'd looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. "Maybe," she'd said finally, before walking away. 2 days later, after an especially grueling day at work and an evening of Lily fighting bedtime every step of the way, Mark had made a decision. He was tired of maybes and mixed signals. Life was too short, he knew that better than most. He'd found Emma's number on the building's resident contact list and, before he could talk himself out of it, sent her a text. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately. Would you like to have dinner with me sometime? Just the two of us." He'd immediately regretted it. Too forward. Too desperate. She probably thought he was a creep now. He'd put his phone down and tried to distract himself with a documentary about penguins, but kept checking for a response every few minutes. Nothing. By midnight, he'd convinced himself he'd made a terrible mistake and would now have to avoid Emma in the hallways forever. He'd finally fallen into a restless sleep around 1 a.m., only to be jolted awake by the chime of his phone at 2:13 a.m. The message from Emma had been simple but shocking. "I've been watching you too, Mark. Meet me on the rooftop in 10 minutes. His heart had raced as he pulled on jeans and a sweatshirt. He'd checked on Lily, sound asleep in her room, then quietly slipped out of the apartment and headed for the stairs to the roof. The night was clear, the city lights spreading out below like fallen stars. Emma was already there, standing by the railing, looking out at the skyline. "I was starting to think you weren't coming," she said without turning around. "I had to make sure Lily was asleep," he replied, moving to stand beside her. "I have a baby monitor app on my phone." Emma nodded, still looking out at the city. "That's what makes this so complicated, Mark." "What do you mean?" She'd turned to face him then, her expression serious. "I like you. More than I should. But there's something you need to know about me, and once I tell you, you might not want anything to do with me." Mark had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What is it?" Emma had taken a deep breath. "My real name is Emma Lawson. I'm an investigative journalist, and I moved into this building 3 months ago to investigate your firm, Sullivan and Reed Architecture." Mark had stared at her, uncomprehending. "What? Why?" "Because I have reason to believe your partner, James Reed, has been cutting corners on building materials and bribing inspectors to look the other way. The theater renovation you're working on? The structural supports they're using are substandard. If there's an earthquake or even a heavy enough snow load on that roof, it could collapse. The world had seemed to tilt beneath Mark's feet. That's impossible. I would know if. Would you? Emma had challenged. You handle the design side. Reed handles the contracts and materials. When was the last time you personally inspected the quality of the steel being used? Mark had felt sick. James had been his friend since college. They'd started the firm together 5 years ago. But there had been things lately, discrepancies in the budget, meetings Mark wasn't invited to, James's new house and car that seemed beyond what the firm's profits should allow. Why are you telling me this? He'd asked, his voice hollow. Emma's eyes had softened. Because tomorrow morning, my article goes live. It names Reed, but it also mentions the firm, which has your name on it. Your reputation will take a hit, even though I make it clear in the piece that there's no evidence you were involved. I couldn't let that happen without warning you. Mark had felt as though he'd been punched in the stomach. So all this time, the conversations, getting to know Lily, it was just for your story? No, Emma had said quickly, reaching for his hand. That's why this is so complicated. It started that way, yes. But then I got to know you, and Lily, and... She'd trailed off, looking away. I've never compromised my professional ethics before. But I'm telling you this now because I care about you. Both of you. Mark had pulled his hand away, anger replacing shock. You've been investigating me for months, pretending to be my friend, maybe something more, and you're just now telling me the night before you publish? How is that caring about us? I tried to keep my distance, Emma had said, her voice tight with emotion. Those headphones? Half the time they weren't even playing anything. I just didn't want to talk to you, to get involved. But then the blackout happened, and Lily was so sweet, and you were just trying so hard to be everything for her. I told myself I could be professional about this, but I couldn't. Mark had turned away, trying to process everything. His business, his reputation, his friendship with James, all of it potentially destroyed. And the woman he'd been falling for had been investigating him all along. I need to see the article, he'd said finally. Emma had hesitated, then pulled out her phone. It's embargoed until 6 a.m., but, here. Mark had read it there on the rooftop, the blue light of the phone illuminating his face as the truth of his partner's betrayal unfolded before him. The evidence was damning, photos of substandard materials, copies of falsified inspection reports, testimony from a whistleblower inside the firm. And true to her word, Emma had made it clear that all evidence pointed to Reed acting alone, with Mark likely unaware of the fraud. When he'd finished reading, he'd handed the phone back to her, his face unreadable. Thank you for showing me this. Mark, I need to go check on Lily, he'd cut her off, already moving toward the door. Mark, please, Emma had called after him. I know you're angry, but... He'd stopped, turning to look at her one last time. I'm not angry at you for doing your job, Emma. I'm angry at myself for not seeing what was happening in my own company. And I'm disappointed that something that felt real to me was just part of your investigation. It wasn't just, she'd started to say, but he was already gone, the door to the stairwell closing behind him. Mark hadn't slept the rest of that night. Instead, he'd called his lawyer, forwarded him Emma's article, and by morning had set in motion the dissolution of his partnership with James Reed. He'd also contacted the city's building inspector and the clients whose projects might be affected, including the historic theater. The next few weeks had been a blur of legal meetings, press inquiries, and damage control. The firm's reputation had taken a massive hit, just as Emma had warned. Several clients had pulled their projects. James was facing criminal charges. And Mark was left trying to rebuild from the ashes while still being a father to Lily, who sensed something was wrong but couldn't understand what. He hadn't seen Emma since that night on the roof. He'd heard from neighbors that she'd moved out of the building the day after her article was published. He told himself it was better this way. Whatever had been developing between them had been built on a foundation of lies, her professional deception, his willful blindness to his partner's crimes. But late at night, when Lily was asleep and the apartment was quiet, he would find himself remembering the sound of Emma's laugh, the way she'd crouched down to talk to Lily during the blackout, the look in her eyes when she'd told him she cared about them both. 3 months after Emma's article, Mark was working late in his home office when his phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. "There's a new exhibit at the Children's Museum about architecture. Lily might like it. They have a building station with foam blocks that's pretty amazing." His heart had skipped a beat. Before he could respond, another text came through. "This is Emma, by the way. I got a new number when I moved. I'm back in Chicago now." Mark had stared at the phone, unsure how to respond or even if he should. Finally, he'd typed, "Why are you telling me this?" The reply had come quickly, "Because I miss you both. And because I want you to know that what happened between us wasn't just for the story. Not for me." Mark had put the phone down without responding. The next day, he'd taken Lily to the Children's Museum. She'd loved the architecture exhibit, just as Emma had said she would. As he'd watched his daughter carefully stacking foam blocks to build what she called a princess castle, he'd found himself thinking about foundations, how they could be solid or flawed, visible or hidden, but always essential. That night, after Lily was asleep, he'd picked up his phone and texted Emma, "Lily loved the museum. Thank you for the recommendation." They'd started talking again after that, cautiously at first, then with growing openness. Emma told him about her new job at the Chicago Tribune, her apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, her cat Hemingway who had adjusted well to city life. Mark shared updates about the new, smaller firm he was building, his commitment to ethical practices and transparency, the progress Lily was making in preschool. 6 months after Emma's article had shattered his world, Mark found himself standing in O'Hare Airport with Lily, waiting for Emma's flight to arrive. They'd agreed to meet in person, to see if there was anything worth salvaging from the connection they'd formed under such complicated circumstances. "Daddy, is Miss Emma nice?" Lily had asked, clutching her stuffed elephant as they waited. Mark had crouched down to his daughter's level, just as he'd seen Emma do during the blackout. "Yes, sweetheart. She's very nice. And she's very honest, which is even more important. Will she be our friend again?" Mark had smiled, seeing Emma walking toward them through the crowd, her face lighting up at the sight of Lily. "I think she might be, honey. I think she might be." It hadn't been easy rebuilding trust. There had been long conversations, painful honesty on both sides, moments when it seemed the damage might be too great to repair. But there had also been laughter, connection, and the gradual realization that sometimes the most solid foundations are built after everything has fallen apart. A year after Emma's 2 a.m. text had shattered Mark's world, she moved back to Portland, not to the same building, but to a house with a small garden where Lily could play. Mark's new firm was thriving, built on principles of integrity and transparency. And he and Emma were taking things one day at a time, building.